In the last lecture, we added different selectors to ensure that our second section and h1 tag doesn't look like our first one. Now maybe there's one thing you did wonder about. We do set the h1 tag to have a white color, and then we set the section title class to set a green color. Now actually both selectors here match our second h1 tag. We still have our h1 selector in place here, so it still selects the second h1 tag too. It doesn't stop selecting it just because we added a class. And then the class seems to override this. Now you could argue this happens because the section title class is defined after the tag selector, and as the file probably is parsed from top to bottom, which it is, this simply overrides the previous rule. You would not be entirely wrong by this, though actually, if you switch the order, just for demo purposes here, and you reload the page, you see that the styling still applies. So the class still overrides the h1 tag's style. On the other hand, if you quickly assign the h1 tag again and set the font family back to serif, and not to Anton, and now you save and reload, you see the h1 tags get changed, so the font did change. So the order does seem to matter, but only if you use the same selector. The class still overrides the color, so that's really strange. And there's one additional strange thing. If the class somehow overrides the styling for the h1 tag, so if it still sets the green color, why doesn't it also clear the font family? Now we set it back to serif manually here with the second rule, but even before we did this, and it becomes clearer if we set this to sans serif, like this. Now it's changed to sans serif style, but not back to Anton. Now you can still see this section title doesn't seem to clear the font family. It clearly overrides the color, but it doesn't reset the font family. So it still keeps that style around. So two things are going on here. Multiple rules seem to affect the same element, and additionally, the different rules here seem to have different priorities, because otherwise, how would we explain that this section title class overrides the color even though it comes before we set up the other rules? Now let's explore what's going on here. And for that, we'll use the developer tools. You can open the developer tools by pressing Command, Option, and I on Mac, or F12 on Windows. Or you open it from the menu of your browser. Here I'm talking about the Chrome developer tools, by the way. Now in the developer tools, you get a couple of options in case you never worked with that. If you click on Elements, you see your HTML code, so to say, and you can select elements by expanding and clicking there. And then at the bottom, you see which styles are getting applied to these elements. You can also select an element from within your page by right-clicking on it and choosing Inspect. This also works if the developer tools are closed. They will open then. If they are opened, it will just jump to that element and select it, as you can see here. And you can also pick that tool here on the top left of the developer tools, and now click on Element in your DOM to also quickly inspect it. Now if we do that on that h1 tag in our second section, and we bring this up a bit here, we can actually see which styles are getting applied. And the list here has to be read from top to bottom, with the topmost style taking the highest priority. Now there you see a couple of styles are indeed getting applied. If you scroll down, these are all styles that are applied to that h1 tag. You see the topmost is actually an empty style. That would be the inline style if you add the style attribute to the h1 tag, because it turns out that inline styles have the highest priority, or this concept is also called specificity to be precise. But then you see that the class selector section title appears. So it seems to have a higher specificity than the h1 selectors which are coming below it. You see two h1 selectors because we got two in our CSS code. And if you watch closely, you see the second one, with just the font family sans serif, has a higher priority or specificity than the first one, simply because it comes second in the file, and the file is parsed top to bottom. But again, as already recognized, the section title class overrides them both, even though it comes earlier in the file, but internally, by the CSS specification, it seems to have a higher specificity. And it does. If you scroll down further, there also are some browser defaults for that element. And these have the lowest priority. They do apply though, but you can override them. And that is something we will also do later. So these are the styles which are getting applied. The fact that we have multiple rules affect the same element is the cascading part of the of the feature we're using here. CSS stands for cascading style sheets. And cascading simply means multiple styles can be applied, or multiple rules can be applied to the same element. Now these rules may lead to conflicts though. Here for example, we got our color set up in the h1 tag and in the section title class. Now to resolve such conflicts, CSS knows a concept called specificity. And there are clear rules included in the CSS specification that define how such conflicts should be resolved and which type of selector has a higher specificity. Now here's an overview. As I said, cascading means multiple rules are applied to the same element. Specificity resolves conflicts arising from that fact, and specificity then simply has the following order. The tag selector and also pseudo element selectors, which we haven't had a look at yet, but which we will see in the course, have the lowest priority, the lowest specificity. Well, actually, the universal selector, that star, has the lowest priority, but you rarely use that. So tag selectors have the lowest one then. A higher specificity is assigned to class and pseudo class as well as attribute selectors. So these three are all in the same level, and if we then have two conflicts here, simply the latter one in the same file wins, just as we had it for the two h1 tags in our CSS file. Now, pseudo classes are also something we'll see later in the course. This is something like controlling hover effects on an element. So if you mouse over it. A higher specificity is assigned to ID selectors. So if an element has a tag, a class, and an ID selector, and they all set the color of that element, the ID selector would actually win, no matter where it is positioned in the CSS file. The highest priority, however, is assigned to inline styles. We saw that earlier, but we shouldn't use them. But if you add them, they will actually override all other styles. They have the highest specificity. Now, there are more rules connected to specificity, some advanced things connected to things like inheritance, which we hadn't a look at yet. But these rules here are important to keep in mind. Tag selectors have the lowest specificity, inline styles have the highest. Now, this doesn't mean that you should always use inline styles. It just means you should be aware of this, and you should style your page cleverly by actually using all these types of selectors, maybe without inline styles though, and simply be aware of how they override each other. And it's actually not hard to work with these correctly, and we will do it throughout the entire project, so there's a lot of space for you to practice it. So back to code then, let's see how this actually has an impact in reality and what else is connected to this concept.